Sirens cut through the humid night air as flashing red and blue lights washed over the polished exterior of a late-model Mercedes. Behind the wheel sat a man whose quiet authority carried more weight than the aggressive patrol officer approaching his window could ever grasp. "Know your place, boy." The officer sneered, snapping cold steel handcuffs around the driver's wrists. He had no idea that in a matter of days, his entire career, his freedom, and his future would rest entirely in the hands of the man he had just humiliated. Rain glazed the quiet asphalt of Hawthorne Drive, an exclusive suburban enclave lined with towering oaks and wrought iron gates. Victor Langford rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the deep ache of a long, grinding day settle into his bones. A man who carried immense responsibility on his shoulders. All he wanted that night was a warm meal, a glass of aged bourbon, and a soft bed. He guided his pristine silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class along the familiar winding roads. Soft, melancholic jazz drifting through the premium speakers, doing little to ease his profound exhaustion. He wore a faded collegiate sweatshirt from Harvard Law and comfortable gray cotton sweatpants, having shed his restrictive charcoal bespoke suit, starched collar, and silk tie hours earlier in the privacy of his chambers. He was barely a mile from his driveway when the glaring headlights of a police cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror. Victor had not been speeding. He had not swerved. His registration was current, and his taillights worked perfectly. Yet the cruiser accelerated, riding dangerously close to his bumper before the inevitable burst of red and blue strobes shattered the peaceful darkness. With a heavy sigh, Victor signaled and smoothly pulled the luxury sedan onto the shoulder, shifting into park. He rolled down his window, switched on the interior dome light, and placed both large hands firmly on the leather steering wheel at 10 and 2. It was a practiced motion, a tragic necessity he had learned decades earlier as a young black man, navigating a world that often judged him long before he ever spoke. Heavy, aggressive footsteps splashed through shallow puddles. Officer Travis Holt swaggered up to the driver's side, one hand resting menacingly on the butt of his holstered service weapon. Holt was in his late 20s, built like a fire hydrant, with a high and tight haircut and a permanent sneer carved into his features. He had a reputation in the precinct for being a hardliner, a cop who thrived on intimidation and absolute compliance. "License, registration, and proof of insurance. Now!" Holt barked, shining his blinding tactical flashlight straight into Victor's eyes. Victor squinted and turned his head slightly. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" "I don't answer to you," Holt snapped, leaning closer, his tone dripping with condescension. "I said license and registration. Are you deaf or just stupid?" Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Decades of presiding over explosive courtrooms had given him an ocean of patience, but the raw disrespect in the young officer's voice grated. "My wallet is in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for my wallet first," Victor stated calmly, his deep baritone steady and even. "Move slow," Holt commanded, his grip tightening on his weapon. Victor slowly retrieved his leather wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it through the window. Holt snatched it, examining the plastic card under his flashlight. He looked from the ID to Victor, then to the luxurious interior of the Mercedes. A cynical, ugly smirk twisted his lips. Victor Langford. Holt read the name deliberately, omitting any title of respect. "This is a pretty expensive ride for a guy dressed like a vagrant. Whose car is this? You steal it from one of these nice houses?" "The vehicle is registered in my name, officer, as you will see when I retrieve the paperwork from the glove box," Victor replied, maintaining eye contact. "Again, I would like to know the legal justification for this traffic stop." "You were drifting over the yellow line," Holt lied effortlessly, "and you look suspicious. You don't belong in this neighborhood. I have lived at 442 Hawthorne Drive for 15 years. Victor corrected him, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the natural authority he wielded every day. It is located exactly 3 blocks from where we are currently parked. Holt let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Yeah, right. Step out of the vehicle. On what grounds? Victor asked, his hands returning to the steering wheel. I have provided my identification. I am not under arrest, and there is no probable cause for a search or a detention. I said step out of the damn car, Holt roared, yanking the driver's side door open. Before Victor could unbuckle his seatbelt, Holt reached in, grabbed him by the collar of his sweatshirt, and hauled the older man out into the freezing rain. Victor stumbled, his knees colliding painfully with the wet asphalt. Before he could regain his balance, Holt shoved him hard against the side of the Mercedes and kicked his legs apart. The cold steel of the handcuffs ratcheted tightly around Victor's wrists, biting into his skin. You people always think you can talk your way out of things, Holt hissed into his ear, breath smelling of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. You think because you're driving a fancy stolen car that you're untouchable. Know your place, boy. Out here, I'm the law. You're nothing. Victor stood perfectly still, rain dripping from his graying hair. He did not fight back. He did not scream. He simply turned his head and looked Holt dead in the eye. I will comply with your orders, Officer Holt, he said softly, memorizing the name tag and badge number. But I assure you, this interaction will be scrutinized on a level you cannot begin to fathom. Shut up. Holt shoved him toward the back of the cruiser. You're going downtown for resisting arrest and failure to comply. Let's see how tough you are in a holding cell. For the rest of the night, Victor Langford remained entirely silent. He did not demand a phone call. He did not scream for a lawyer. When the desk sergeant booked him, fingerprinting him and confiscating his belongings, Victor politely complied with every directive. He knew the system intimately, better than anyone in that filthy, fluorescent-lit precinct. He knew that revealing his identity now would only cause the police to sweep the incident under the rug, bury the body camera footage, and offer hollow apologies to save their own careers. Victor did not want an apology. He wanted absolute, undeniable justice. And as he sat on the cold concrete bench of the holding cell, listening to the drunken ramblings of the other inmates, Judge Victor Langford began to meticulously build his case. Morning sunlight cut violently through the dusty horizontal blinds of the 42nd Precinct's bullpen, casting long shadows across the chaotic maze of gray metal desks. Officer Travis Holt leaned back in his squeaky rolling chair, boots propped arrogantly on the edge of his desk. He held a foam cup of bitter black coffee, regaling 2 younger rookies with the exaggerated tale of his previous night's conquest. I'm telling you, the guy thought he was some kind of hotshot mobster or something, Holt boasted, taking a sip. Driving a $100,000 Mercedes in sweatpants, started getting lippy with me, asking about probable cause like he watched a few episodes of Law and Order. I snatched him right out of the driver's seat. You should have seen his face. Put him right in his place. What did the desk sergeant say? One of the rookies asked, wide-eyed. Booked him for resisting and disorderly. Holt shrugged dismissively. Honestly, I didn't even bother finishing the full arrest narrative yet. DA will probably downgrade it to a misdemeanor, but the point was made. You don't disrespect the badge in my sector. Holt checked his heavy steel wristwatch, swung his boots off the desk, and stood to adjust his rigid gun belt. Today was not a day for petty traffic arrests. Today was the most consequential day of his career in law enforcement. For many months, he had been assigned to a joint task force assisting the federal government in Operation Ironclad, a massive RICO investigation aimed at dismantling the Castellano crime syndicate that had been terrorizing the city's docks. Holt had been the first responding officer on a crucial warehouse raid that yielded illegal firearms, 60 kilos of narcotics, and the syndicate's encrypted ledgers. His body camera footage and subsequent testimony regarding the chain of custody of that ledger were the absolute linchpins of the federal prosecutor's case. If he performed well on the stand today, the chief of police had practically guaranteed him a gold detective's shield. He walked into the precinct's locker room, swapping his standard patrol uniform for a sharply pressed navy blue suit. He slicked his hair back, admiring his reflection in the smudged mirror. He felt untouchable. He was the star witness for the United States Department of Justice. An hour later, Holt marched through the towering marble columns of the United States District Court for the Southern District. The federal courthouse was a cathedral of justice, vastly different from the gritty, crumbling municipal courts he was used to. The floors were polished terrazzo, the ceilings vaulted and adorned with intricate murals, and the air thick with quiet, hushed authority. He found Assistant United States Attorney Elena Vargas pacing nervously in the corridor outside courtroom 4B. Elena was a razor-sharp, fiercely intelligent prosecutor who had spent years building the Castellano case. She looked up as Holt approached, her eyes scanning his suit. "Officer Holt, you're late," she said sharply, clutching a thick stack of manila folders to her chest. "Traffic was a nightmare, counselor." Holt offered a charming, easy smile. "Don't worry, I'm here. I know my testimony front to back. The ledger was secured, chain of custody was pristine, and I can identify the defendants. We're going to put these scumbags away for life." Elena did not return the smile. She looked visibly pale, exhausted by the crushing weight of the trial. "Listen to me very carefully, Holt. The defense attorneys for the Castellano family are absolute sharks. They have a combined hourly rate that exceeds your yearly salary. They're going to attack your character, your history, your police work, and your temperament. You cannot let them bait you. Do you understand? I've testified 100 times." Holt brushed off her concern. "I know how to handle defense attorneys. Not in this court," Elena warned, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And certainly not in front of this judge. We were randomly assigned a new presiding judge this morning after Judge Harrison suffered a medical emergency. The man we drew is a legend. He is brilliant. He is ruthless regarding constitutional rights, and he has zero tolerance for police misconduct or perjury. If you step out of line, he won't just strike your testimony. He will hold you in contempt and throw you in federal lockup." "I got it, Elena. Relax. Who is the judge anyway?" Holt asked. Completely unbothered. Before she could answer, the heavy, intricately carved mahogany doors of courtroom 4B swung open. The gruff voice of the courtroom bailiff echoed into the hallway. "Court is in session. All parties for United States versus Castellano. Please enter." Holt puffed out his chest, straightened his silk tie, and strode confidently into the massive courtroom. The room was breathtaking. Rows of polished oak pews were packed with reporters, federal agents, and onlookers. At the defense table sat 3 grim-faced mobsters, flanked by a small army of expensive, impeccably dressed lawyers. Holt took his seat directly behind the prosecutor's table, feeling a rush of adrenaline. This was his moment. This was the stage where he would secure his legacy. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed like thunder, instantly silencing the chaotic murmurs. Every single person in the courtroom stood in unison. The heavy wooden door behind the elevated judicial bench clicked open. "The United States District Court for the Southern District is now in session. The Honorable Judge Victor Langford presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court." Holt's heart suddenly skipped a beat. The name sounded vaguely, uncomfortably familiar, though his brain was moving too fast to place it. He watched as a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged from the private chambers. The judge stepped up to the bench, his flowing black robes commanding absolute reverence from every soul in the room. He moved with a quiet, terrifying grace. When the judge finally turned to face the courtroom and took his seat, the overhead lights illuminated his stern, deeply lined face. Holt stopped breathing. All the blood drained from his face, leaving him chalk white. His stomach plummeted into a bottomless abyss, and his hands began to tremble violently against the polished wood of the prosecutor's table. Sitting high above him, looking down with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm, was the man Holt had dragged out of a Mercedes, handcuffed in the rain, and thrown into a concrete cell only a short time before. Judge Victor Langford picked up his wooden gavel and let it fall with a deafening crack. "Be seated," the judge commanded, his eyes locked directly onto Officer Travis Holt. "We have a great deal of work to do today." Absolute silence gripped courtroom 4B as Judge Langford organized the thick stack of legal briefs on his elevated mahogany desk. His face remained an unreadable mask of absolute judicial neutrality, betraying no sign of the violent, humiliating encounter that had taken place on the rain-slicked asphalt of Hawthorne Drive. From his towering vantage point, Victor surveyed the crowded room. His piercing gaze swept over the jury box, the defense table, and finally rested squarely on the prosecution's star witness. Officer Travis Holt felt a cold, paralyzing dread spread through his chest, radiating outward until his fingertips went entirely numb. His stomach churned violently, a toxic mixture of the bitter precinct coffee and pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt as though it had been packed with dry sand. The man sitting on the bench, the man holding the gavel, the man draped in the sacred black robes of the federal judiciary, was the exact same man Holt had violently hauled out of a luxury sedan, handcuffed, and shoved into the back of a police cruiser like a common vagrant. Elena Vargas, completely oblivious to the catastrophic internal collapse happening to her star witness, approached the podium. She confidently adjusted her microphone, ready to secure the convictions that would define her career as a federal prosecutor. "Your Honor, the United States calls Officer Travis Holt to the stand," she announced, her voice ringing clearly across the sprawling courtroom. Holt did not move. He sat frozen in the chair behind the prosecution's table, his wide, panicked eyes locked on Judge Langford. The silence stretched for several agonizing seconds. People in the gallery began to shift uncomfortably. "Officer Holt," Judge Langford said, his deep, resonant baritone echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The government has called you to testify. You will approach the witness stand and be sworn in by the bailiff. Now." Shaking visibly, Holt stood. His legs felt like lead pillars as he navigated the short distance to the witness box. Every step echoed loudly against the polished terrazzo floor, sounding like the rhythmic beating of a funeral drum. He raised his right hand, his fingers trembling so violently that the bailiff gave him a deeply concerned look before administering the oath. "Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" "I do," Holt stammered, his voice cracking pitifully. Taking his seat in this witness box, Holt felt completely exposed. He was trapped in a wooden cage directly to the left of the judge's bench. Langford was seated less than 4 feet away, looking down at him with an intensity that made the young officer want to spontaneously combust. Elena Vargas smiled warmly at him, trying to project confidence. "Officer Holt, could you please state your full name and current assignment for the record?" "Travis Cole Holt, Patrol Officer, 42nd Precinct, currently assigned to the Joint Federal Task Force for Organized Crime," he managed to say, though his usual arrogant swagger had completely vanished, replaced by the terrified demeanor of a cornered animal. "Officer Holt, I want to direct your attention to the night of the warehouse raid. Can you tell the court where you were and what you were doing?" For the next half hour, Elena carefully walked Holt through the events of the raid. Holt recited his practiced testimony, but his delivery was horrific. He stuttered, lost his train of thought, and constantly darted nervous glances toward the judge. He described breaching the metal doors, securing the perimeter, and discovering the encrypted ledgers in the back office. Yet every time he spoke about securing evidence or following protocol, Judge Langford leaned forward ever so slightly, a physical movement that sent shock waves of panic down Holt's spine. Elena noticed her witness unraveling and tried to throw him a lifeline. "Officer, you are absolutely certain that you maintained the chain of custody for the Castellano ledger. You followed every departmental regulation to ensure no constitutional rights were violated during the seizure of this evidence." Holt opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, Judge Langford intervened. "Counselor," Langford's voice cut through the air like a steel blade, "let us allow the witness to answer the question without leading him. Officer Holt, you are under oath. You are testifying that your adherence to constitutional rights and departmental protocol is flawless. Is that correct?" The double meaning was so heavy it practically crushed the oxygen out of the room. Holt felt a bead of cold sweat roll down his temple. He knew exactly what the judge was doing. Langford was meticulously building a trap, forcing him to testify to his own impeccable character on the federal record. "Yes, Your Honor," Holt croaked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I always follow protocol." Judge Langford stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, suffocating. Langford picked up his gold fountain pen, made a single deliberate note on his legal pad, and looked back up. "The court notes your sworn statement, Officer Holt. You may proceed, Ms. Vargas." Elena wrapped up her direct examination shortly afterward, highly disturbed by Holt's erratic behavior, but confident that the basic facts of the raid were safely on the record. She took her seat, completely unaware that the real trial was only just beginning. Judge Langford turned his gaze to the defense table, where three high-powered attorneys were whispering furiously to one another. "Mr. Sinclair," Langford addressed the lead defense attorney, a silver-haired legal shark known for completely destroying police witnesses on the stand. "You may begin your cross-examination of this witness." Gregory Sinclair stood, buttoning his expensive tailored suit jacket. He picked up a thick red folder from his table and walked slowly toward the podium, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sinclair said smoothly. He turned to face Holt, his eyes narrowing. "Officer Holt, you have painted quite a picture for us today. A picture of a diligent, by-the-book police officer who respects the law. But I think we need to look a little closer at the artist before we can trust the painting. Wouldn't you agree?" Sweating profusely inside his expensive navy suit, Holt gripped the edges of the witness stand until his knuckles turned completely white. He was acutely aware of the massive jury box to his right, where 12 citizens were scrutinizing his every terrified twitch. He was aware of the ruthless mobsters sitting at the defense table, men who would not hesitate to order a hit if they beat this federal indictment. But above all else, he was hyper-aware of Judge Victor Langford, the silent executioner sitting just inches away, holding the power to end his life as he knew it. Sinclair leaned casually against the wooden podium, flipping open his thick red file. "Officer Holt, during direct examination with Ms. Vargas, you testified under penalty of perjury that you have a flawless record of respecting constitutional rights. You stated you always follow protocol. Do you stand by that absolute statement today?" Holt swallowed hard. "I do." "Fascinating," Sinclair mused, pulling a sheet of paper from the file. "Because I have here your internal affairs file, obtained via subpoena just this morning. It seems, officer, that you have accumulated 7 separate citizen complaints in the last 3 years alone. Complaints alleging excessive force, unlawful detention, and racial profiling. Are you familiar with these documents?" Elena Vargas shot out of her chair. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. This is a RICO trial about organized crime. not a disciplinary hearing for Officer Holt. His internal affairs file is highly prejudicial and completely irrelevant to the facts of the warehouse raid. Holt felt a brief, desperate surge of hope. If the judge sustained the objection, he might survive this nightmare. He looked pleadingly at the bench. Judge Langford did not even look at the prosecutor. His dark eyes remained fixed entirely on the trembling police officer. "Overruled," Langford stated coldly. "The government has built its entire chain of custody on the credibility and integrity of this specific officer. If he has a documented history of constitutional violations, the jury has an absolute right to weigh that history against his current testimony. You may proceed, Mr. Sinclair." Elena sank slowly back into her chair, her face pale. She had never seen a federal judge allow such wide latitude for a character attack on a sworn officer without a fierce fight in chambers. Sinclair smiled, sensing blood in the water. "Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Officer Holt, let us talk about your temperament. Let us talk about your deep, abiding respect for the law. In fact, we don't even need to go back 3 years. Let us go back merely a short time. Where were you on the night between the hours of 10 and midnight?" Holt felt the floor drop out from beneath him. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears. How could Sinclair possibly know about that? He hadn't filed the final arrest report yet. He had left the paperwork sitting on his desk at the precinct, planning to downgrade the charges to avoid any scrutiny. "I was on patrol," Holt stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward Judge Langford, who sat perfectly still, observing the destruction with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. "On patrol in the affluent Hawthorne Drive neighborhood, correct?" Sinclair pressed, pacing in front of the jury box. "A neighborhood far outside your usual sector. And while you were on patrol, you initiated a traffic stop. You pulled over a silver Mercedes-Benz. Can you tell this court under oath what your probable cause was for initiating that stop?" "The vehicle was drifting over the yellow line," Holt lied, the exact same lie he had used on the street. "Drifting." Sinclair raised an eyebrow, feigning intense curiosity. "Officer, I have here the GPS telematics data from that specific Mercedes-Benz, subpoenaed directly from the manufacturer. It shows the vehicle was traveling exactly at the posted speed limit, maintained its lane flawlessly, and used its turn signal perfectly. The data completely contradicts your sworn testimony. Did you fabricate your probable cause, Officer Holt?" "Objection!" Elena yelled, now genuinely panicked. "Your Honor, defense counsel is ambushing the witness with an entirely unrelated traffic stop." "The objection is overruled, Ms. Vargas," Langford's voice boomed, carrying a terrifying authority. "Credibility is always on trial in this courtroom. Officer Holt, you will answer the question. Did you fabricate the probable cause for that traffic stop?" Holt was hyperventilating. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in on him. If he admitted to lying, his testimony in this RICO case would instantly collapse, allowing dangerous mobsters to walk free, and he would be facing federal perjury charges. If he stuck to his lie, he was committing perjury directly in front of the man he had unlawfully arrested. "I believed he was drifting," Holt whispered weakly. "You believed?" Sinclair mocked him. "Let's talk about what happened next. After you pulled over this citizen who had committed no crime, you demanded his identification. He provided it. He was polite, compliant, and well within his rights. And how did you respond, officer? Did you issue a warning? A citation?" Sinclair turned his back on Holt and faced the packed gallery, raising his voice so it echoed against the marble walls. "You dragged a 58-year-old man out of his vehicle. You threw him against the side of his car, handcuffed him in the freezing rain, and arrested him without a shred of legal justification. You told him, and I quote from the precinct holding cell logs, where you boasted about your arrest to the desk sergeant, to know his place. Tell me, Officer Holt, what exactly is the place of an innocent citizen who knows his constitutional rights?" The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. Reporters frantically scribbled in their notepads. Elena Vargas buried her face in her hands, realizing her entire case was actively disintegrating before her eyes. Judge Langford banged his gavel a single time. The loud crack silenced the room instantly. He leaned over the high wooden bench, bringing his face perilously close to the witness stand. "Officer Holt," Judge Langford said softly, his voice carrying a lethal quiet menace that chilled Holt to his very soul. "Before you answer Mr. Sinclair's question, I want to remind you of the gravity of this venue. You are sitting in a federal courtroom. You are sitting in my federal courtroom. I strongly suggest you think very, very carefully about your next words. Because the truth, no matter how deeply you try to bury it, always finds its way into the light." Sweat poured down Travis Holt's face in thick, cold rivulets, soaking the starched collar of his expensive Navy suit. He sat trapped inside the witness box, completely paralyzed by the horrifying reality of his situation. The massive federal courtroom, packed with reporters, federal agents, and jurors, felt as though it had shrunk to the size of a suffocating closet. Directly in front of him stood Gregory Sinclair, the ruthless defense attorney, holding the absolute destruction of Holt's life in a red manila folder. To his immediate left sat Judge Victor Langford, the silent architect of his pending doom, watching him with eyes that held no mercy. "I am waiting for an answer, Officer Holt," Sinclair prompted, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "You told an innocent, compliant citizen to know his place. Could you please articulate for the jury and for the court what exactly you meant by that highly specific phrase?" Holt opened his mouth, but only a pathetic dry rasp escaped his throat. He looked desperately toward the prosecution table. Elena Vargas sat completely rigid, her face devoid of color. She was a brilliant prosecutor, and she instantly realized that her star witness had just detonated her entire case. She offered Holt no lifeline, no objection, and no salvation. She simply stared at him in unadulterated horror. "I was just securing the scene," Holt finally stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "It was a high-stress environment. It was dark. I didn't know who he was or what he was capable of doing." "A high-stress environment." Sinclair laughed sharply, turning to face the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, it was a quiet, affluent suburban street. The driver was a 58-year-old man in sweatpants listening to jazz music. He handed you his identification and calmly asked why he was being detained. In response, you physically assaulted him." Sinclair walked back to his table and picked up a small digital drive. "Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to enter into evidence Defense Exhibit D, the raw, unedited body camera footage from Officer Holt's uniform on the night in question, subpoenaed directly from the precinct's data servers early this morning." Elena Vargas closed her eyes, silently mourning the death of her career. "Admitted," Judge Langford stated firmly, his baritone voice echoing through the silent room. "Bailiff, please activate the courtroom monitors." Large, flat-screen televisions descended from the ceiling, facing the jury box, the gallery, and the witness stand. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. Holt gripped the wooden railing of the witness box so hard his knuckles ached. He was about to watch his own professional execution broadcast in high definition. The screens flickered to life. The footage started with the glaring strobes of the police cruiser illuminating the silver Mercedes-Benz. The audio hissed with the sound of falling rain. The entire courtroom watched as Holt aggressively approached the window, shining his tactical flashlight into the driver's face. The audio captured Holt's voice, loud, arrogant, and dripping with racist condescension. "I don't answer to you. I said license and registration. Are you deaf or just stupid?" Gasps rippled through the gallery. Several reporters began typing frantically on their laptops. The video continued, showing the driver, whose face was partially obscured by the camera angle, remaining perfectly calm, polite, and completely compliant. The jury heard the driver explain his residence, state his rights, and ask for legal justification. Then they watched in absolute horror as Holt violently ripped the door open, hauled the older man out by his collar, slammed him against the wet metal of the car, and aggressively ratcheted handcuffs onto his wrists. And then the most damning phrase echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art speakers of the federal courtroom. "You think because you're driving a fancy stolen car that you're untouchable? Know your place, boy. Out here, I'm the law. You're nothing." Sinclair paused the video right on Holt's sneering face. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and absolute. The members of the jury looked at Holt with undisguised disgust. Even the Castellano crime syndicate defendants, hardened mobsters sitting at the defense table, exchanged bewildered glances. "You're the law," Sinclair repeated softly, walking slowly toward the witness stand. "You told him he was nothing. Officer Holt, you are sitting here today asking this jury to believe your testimony. You are asking them to believe that you meticulously followed constitutional protocol when securing evidence against my clients. Yet only a short time ago, you fabricated probable cause, committed battery against a peaceful citizen, unlawfully detained him, and hurled racial slurs at him simply because he drove a nice car." Holt was actively hyperventilating. "That was an isolated incident. I had a bad night. It has nothing to do with this case. The Castellano evidence is clean." "Is it?" Sinclair roared, slamming his hand down on the podium. "If you are willing to lie on an official police report to cover up your violent abuse of power one night, why in God's name should this jury believe you aren't lying the next day to secure a federal conviction?" Sinclair took a deep breath, adjusting his lapels. He looked up at the judge, a man he deeply respected, knowing full well the monumental restraint Victor Langford was currently exercising. "Officer Holt," Sinclair said, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper, "do you know who the man in that Mercedes was? Did you ever bother to read the identification he handed you before you threw him in a cage?" Holt looked desperately around the room, completely broken. "I don't remember." "Allow me to refresh your memory," Sinclair said, turning his back on the witness. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for this thoroughly corrupt, fundamentally dishonest witness." Whispers erupted throughout the gallery like wildfire, filling the massive federal courtroom with chaotic noise. Reporters were practically climbing over one another to get a better view of the collapsing police officer. Judge Victor Langford picked up his heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block twice. The sharp, explosive cracks instantly silenced the room, restoring the absolute reverence his courtroom demanded. Elena Vargas stood up slowly from the prosecution table. She looked physically ill. Months of exhaustive investigative work, thousands of hours of surveillance, and millions of taxpayer dollars had just been completely incinerated by the staggering arrogance of a single dirty cop. She knew her ethical duty as an officer of the court. She could not, under any circumstances, rely on tainted testimony. "Your Honor," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly before she forcefully steadied it. "The government is utterly appalled by the evidence presented here today. We cannot, in good conscience, proceed with Officer Holt as our witness. The United States respectfully moves to strike the entirety of Officer Holt's testimony from the official record." Judge Langford nodded slowly, his face an impenetrable fortress of judicial authority. "The motion to strike is granted. The jury is instructed to completely disregard all testimony provided by Officer Travis Holt." Holt felt his entire career completely evaporate into thin air. He had lost his golden detective's shield. He had lost the Castellano case. He was entirely disgraced. He began to stand up from the wooden witness chair, eager to flee the suffocating courtroom and hide from the piercing stares of the jury. "Sit down, officer," Judge Langford commanded. The sheer force of the order caused Holt's knees to buckle, and he dropped heavily back into the chair. "Your Honor, I have been dismissed as a witness," Holt whimpered, his false bravado entirely shattered. "You have been dismissed by the prosecution," Langford corrected him, his dark eyes locking onto the terrified cop. "You have not been dismissed by this court. We are not finished." Judge Langford folded his large hands together, resting them on top of the towering mahogany bench. He looked down at the trembling man who had stripped him of his dignity, assaulted him in the rain, and thrown him into a concrete cell. Langford did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet, terrifying certainty in his tone was infinitely more devastating than any shout. "Officer Holt, you took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States," Langford began, the silence in the courtroom so absolute you could hear a pin drop. "You swore to protect and serve your community. Instead, you have demonstrated a staggering, systemic rot. You operate under the delusion that a badge grants you immunity from the very laws you are tasked with enforcing. You stalked a citizen, fabricated a legal justification to detain him, physically assaulted him, and then stood in my courtroom under penalty of perjury and lied about it to a federal jury." Holt was openly weeping now, silent tears tracking through the heavy sweat on his face. He shook his head frantically. "I didn't know who he was." "That is precisely the point." Langford's voice cracked like a whip. "It does not matter who he was. Whether he was a sanitation worker, a high school teacher, a mechanic, or a federal judge, his constitutional rights remain exactly the same. You did not abuse a title. You abused a human being." Langford leaned forward, closing the physical distance between them. The overhead lights cast deep shadows across his face. "You told that citizen to know his place," Langford quoted, the words hanging heavily in the air. "You told him he was nothing. You felt absolute power because you held the handcuffs and the weapon. You assumed that because he was a black man in a wealthy neighborhood, he was inherently criminal. You stripped him of his humanity simply because you could." Holt buried his face in his hands, completely shattered. The weight of his own arrogance was finally crushing him. "Well, Officer Holt," Langford continued, his voice resonating with ultimate authority, "allow me to introduce myself properly. I am the Honorable Victor Langford. And the man you dragged out of that Mercedes, the man you assaulted in the rain, the man you threw into a holding cell, was me." A collective deafening gasp erupted from the jury box. Several jurors physically recoiled in shock. The mobsters at the defense table stared at the judge in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Even the seasoned courtroom bailiffs looked absolutely stunned. Holt slowly lowered his hands, staring up at the bench with wide, bloodshot eyes. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just assaulted a civilian. He hadn't just arrested a lawyer. He had violently arrested the presiding federal judge of the United States District Court. "Your Honor, please. I am so sorry," Holt begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. "I will resign. I will turn in my badge today. Please." "You will not resign," Langford stated coldly, "because you are no longer a police officer. Travis Holt, you are hereby found in direct criminal contempt of this federal court for flagrant perjury on the witness stand." Langford picked up his pen and signed a document on his desk with sharp, deliberate strokes. "Furthermore, I am drafting an immediate referral to the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I am officially recommending you be indicted for federal civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, as well as federal perjury. You are a disgrace to the uniform, and you are a danger to the public." Langford looked past the crying man and locked eyes with the armed federal marshals standing at the back of the courtroom. "United States Marshals," Judge Langford ordered, his voice echoing like the wrath of God, "take this man into federal custody." Heavy combat boots pounded against the terrazzo floor as 3 massive federal marshals sprinted down the center aisle. They descended upon the witness box. Holt did not fight back. He went entirely limp as the marshals hauled him out of the wooden chair. "Know your place, Mr. Holt," Judge Langford said softly, as the marshals aggressively ratcheted heavy steel handcuffs onto the corrupt officer's wrists. Holt was marched down the center aisle of the courtroom, paraded in front of the disgusted jury, the stunned gallery, and the flashing cameras of the press. He was weeping hysterically, his expensive suit rumpled, his dignity completely destroyed. He had walked into the federal courthouse as a rising star, an arrogant king of the streets. He was leaving it in chains, facing decades in federal prison, thoroughly dismantled by the quiet, absolute justice of the man he had dared to humiliate. Chaos completely engulfed the federal courthouse the moment the heavy oak door swung shut behind the disgraced former officer. Reporters sprinted out of the gallery, aggressively speaking into their cell phones to contact their news desks. The absolute destruction of a star witness and the shocking revelation of the judge's true identity was the kind of explosive front-page headline that journalists dreamed about. Inside courtroom 4B, however, the heavy atmosphere remained rigidly controlled by the man wearing the black robes. Gregory Sinclair, seizing the undeniable momentum of the moment, immediately stepped back up to the wooden podium. His clients, the Castellano crime syndicate lieutenants, were grinning from ear to ear, sensing an impending dismissal. Sinclair adjusted his silk tie, his voice ringing out with immense confidence. "Your Honor, in light of the staggering and unprecedented perjury we have just witnessed, the defense moves for an immediate mistrial with prejudice," Sinclair declared boldly. "The government's entire chain of custody regarding the encrypted ledgers relies heavily on the testimony of a thoroughly corrupt, racist, and violent police officer. If Officer Holt is willing to fabricate probable cause and physically assault a federal judge, we cannot trust a single piece of evidence he has touched. This entire case is fatally poisoned." Elena Vargas slowly rose from the prosecution table, her shoulders heavy with the devastating reality of the situation. She was a woman of deep integrity, and she knew exactly what she had to do. She did not attempt to argue the impossible. "The United States concedes that the credibility of our primary responding officer has been irrevocably destroyed," Elena stated, her voice tight with suppressed anger at Holt. "However, Your Honor, the government argues that the physical evidence, the narcotics, and the illegal firearms were seized by other agents on the scene. We ask for a brief recess to evaluate which charges can still be ethically pursued without relying on Holt's tainted reports." Judge Langford did not immediately respond. He looked out over the sprawling courtroom, carefully weighing the foundational tenets of the law against the grim reality of the situation. He was not a man driven by emotion, revenge, or ego. He was the living embodiment of the Constitution. "Mr. Sinclair, your motion for a mistrial is denied at this time," Langford ruled, his baritone voice echoing with absolute finality. The smug smiles on the mobsters' faces instantly vanished. "While Officer Holt is a disgrace to the badge, I will not unilaterally throw out a massive federal racketeering case without giving the prosecution the opportunity to present untainted evidence. Ms. Vargas, you have until tomorrow morning to restructure your case. If you cannot establish a clean chain of custody without relying on that corrupt officer, I will dismiss the charges. Court is in recess." By nightfall, the fallout from courtroom 4B had triggered an absolute political earthquake. The United States Department of Justice moved with terrifying, unprecedented speed. Before the evening news broadcasts even went on the air, a heavily armed team of federal agents raided the 42nd precinct. They confiscated all computer hard drives, internal affairs files, and communication logs. The chief of police, a man named Raymond Torres, was forced to hold a highly embarrassing press conference where he publicly suspended 3 other officers who had laughed about Holt's unlawful arrest in the holding cell. Only a short time after his arrogant, violent assault on Hawthorne Drive, Travis Holt found himself sitting on a cold concrete bench inside a federal holding facility. He was no longer wearing a sharply pressed navy suit. He was dressed in a humiliating, brightly colored orange jumpsuit. He had been denied bail, deemed a severe flight risk, and a danger to the community. As he stared blankly at the metal bars of his cell, the crushing reality of his new life finally settled in. He was going to federal prison. The very system he had so arrogantly weaponized against the innocent had flawlessly turned its massive, unrelenting gears against him. Miles away from the gritty municipal jail, the evening rain began to fall once again over the affluent, quiet neighborhood of Hawthorne Drive. The streetlights flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the wet asphalt. Victor Langford navigated his pristine silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class through the familiar winding roads. The soft, melancholic jazz playing through the premium speakers filled the quiet cabin. He wore a comfortable, faded collegiate sweatshirt from Harvard Law, having shed his restrictive judicial robes and heavy responsibilities for the evening. He pulled smoothly into his driveway, parked the luxury vehicle, and turned off the engine. For a long, silent moment, Victor simply sat in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof of the car. He gently rubbed his wrists where the faint, purplish bruises from cold steel handcuffs were finally beginning to fade. He had not sought out a confrontation that night. He had merely demanded the dignity and respect that every single human being rightfully deserved. Victor opened the car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. He walked up the stone pathway toward his home, a quiet, peaceful man who had reminded a corrupt world that true power does not come from a badge, a weapon, or arrogant intimidation. True power comes from an unwavering, relentless commitment to the truth. Justice is not a privilege. It is an absolute right. Judge Victor Langford proved that the law applies equally to everyone, no matter what badge they wear or what authority they claim to hold. Travis Holt thought he could violently abuse his power in the dark, never realizing he was pulling over the very man who would permanently end his corrupt career in the blinding light of a federal courtroom. If you loved this satisfying story of ultimate karma and undeniable justice, please hit that like button. Share this video with everyone you know and subscribe to the channel for more explosive storytelling.